All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Karen Hernandez, and I am the Program Officer of Partnerships in Interreligious Education at Religions for Peace International. I'm part of the International Secretariat out of New York. And today, our panel discussion is on religious, restorative, and reconciliatory practices in building beloved communities. Long, long title. We have some amazing experts with us today, and I welcome everybody in the audience, and I also welcome everyone online. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you being here. The format of this session will be where each of our esteemed speakers will talk about 4 to 5 minutes on the work they are doing out in the world, as well as anything else they'd like to share. And then we have some guiding questions. And then we're going to actually have an interactive discussion amongst ourselves. We will take questions from the audience after that, and then we'll close. So many people, in regard to kind of restorative practices, restorative justice, it's not necessarily new in the world, but it is encroaching more and more upon, if you will, the Western world and the Western framework of our justice system. And there are a lot of ways to describe it: restorative justice, transformative justice, reconciliation, forgiveness. It involves trauma, it involves narratives, it involves finding the divine even in those who cause harm, and recognizing the divinity of all humans. And how does faith play into that work? All of these things we're going to discuss today. One of my sayings that I go to a lot when I'm doing this work is hurt people, healed people, heal people. And so as we do this work and we talk amongst ourselves, I hope for a rich conversation. Today, joining us, we have speakers from several areas. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker and give their bio, and then we'll go down the line. So first, joining us today is Raphael Gould. He is a consultant with the ACT Alliance. And Raphael is a research fellow with the Social Change and Transgressive Studies Project at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has done extensive fieldwork with gangs in both El Salvador and Ecuador, where much of his research has focused on developing viable alternatives to the war on gangs. His most recent publication is the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Gang Studies. He has a Master's of Philosophy in Latin American Studies from the University of Oxford, and he lives in El Salvador. So I will pass the floor to you, Raphael. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. No, well, first of all, thanks so much for this invitation. It's been amazing to be in dialogue with so many interesting people doing great work in their communities. So the idea is just to sort of introduce a little bit, right, our work and what we've done. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, so I work mainly in El Salvador, where I live, and I also work in Ecuador. And I've basically been working with gangs since 2013. And Ecuador and El Salvador are sort of unique context in that you have, there's this space between where the gangs and the state operate, right? And there's this tendency towards mediating with gangs and criminal actors. And so a lot of my work, academic work, has been focused on that. But as I spend more time in these areas, and as the years go by, I'm more and more convinced that the role of religious communities is one of the most indispensable components of trying to create a more peaceful society. Because even in the case of El Salvador, recently, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We beat America. Used to be number one, but now we're number one. And we have 2% of the population is now in prison. And it really shows just this sort of, when mano dura or iron fist policing is brought to its extreme, this is sort of the bedrock of many authoritarian populist governments in Latin America, right? And one of the problems is that this sort of punitive populism is able to grow because the religious communities and civil society, they're not able to sort of create a different discourse, a counter narrative that humanizes the most irredeemable members of society. And whether you're from Port-au-Prince or you're in Rio de Janeiro or Medellin or San Salvador, we all have this problem of urban violence, right? We've spoken a lot in these panels about migration, about corruption, about religious freedom, but there's another issue which is very big, which is violence, and in particular criminal violence. And for a long time, religious communities have really struggled to sort of come up with a language. A lot of progress has been made thanks to Homeboy, which is really inspiring for a lot of us working with gangs. But I think the reason that gangs are so interesting to look at is because they really are the most irredeemable members of society, right? And so when we talk about democratic backsliding and polarization, it's because we struggle to sort of humanize the other. But the sort of, for me, when we talk about solidarity as religious communities, that has to also include the criminal. And if we don't, then we have a big problem. And that gangs are not these sort of monolithic entities. They respond to larger social, economic, political conditions. And so looking at the gang as a sort of epiphenomenon of the crisis, multiple sort of confluence of different crises in Latin America is really important. Just to say that the work that we do in El Salvador has been very working directly in this space between gangs and the state, but I feel more and more convinced now that the real work has to be done with religious communities.
Great, thank you so much. All right, next we have joining us is Shirley Torres, is the Chief Program Officer of Homeboy Industries, which is the largest gang intervention program and therapeutic community in the United States. Homeboy Industries serves 12,000 former gang members. I'm not sure if that number's right, Shirley, so you can correct me later. And high-risk youth a year in a city with over 80,000 known gang members, which is where we are right now. In her current capacity, she leads the agency in strategies to receive, engage, and retain citizens returning from California state and federal prisons, county jail, and juvenile detention centers. And Shirley also has her Master's of Social Work. And we are thrilled that you're here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored and privileged to be here and for the invitation to be together and have a conversation today. They say that the experiences that change and alter your lives the most are the experiences that don't ask you for permission. And when I think about the men and women who walk through our doors, 12,000 a year, who we serve, seeking for a chance to be seen, to be felt, and to be treated like human beings for the first time, I feel eternally honored that that's been my life's work for the past 2 decades. There's no other place I'd rather be than at Homeboy Industries, where I feel God is more present than any other place on earth. And I say that with conviction because I came to Homeboy 20 years ago naively, thinking that I grew up in a neighborhood surrounded by gangs and violence and despair. And I knew that choices and chances weren't created equal. But when I came to Homeboy, being the first in my family to go to college, I thought I was there to save people who I grew up with. And I was wrong. And I know you introduced us as experts, but I've really been a student of the men and women that walk through our doors. And my biggest job, more than my title, has been to pay attention to the swing of the door. And when I came there, I had to abandon everything I thought I knew about poverty, about my own trauma, about what it was to save people, and to really understand what service was about. Homeboy Industries started 34 years ago in a community surrounded by 8 warring gangs, and it was given birth by a prayer of women and Father Greg Boyle, who came together and said, how do we not ignore this idea that is in the world, that there may be lives that are more important than others, and how do we give hope? And so they gave birth to starting with jobs. And so Homeboy Industries started as a jobs training program 34 years ago as a way to meet people where they are and give young people hope. We say at Homeboy, no hopeful kid ever joins a gang. And when we think about the homes and the communities and the schools that the men and women that I've met come from, we understand that the lights have been dim and the doors have been closed to them. And so Homeboy is there as a sanctuary to keep the door open and to say, you're exactly what God had in mind when he made you. And we bombard them with the idea that they matter and that they belong and that they're there to teach us. And so Homeboy started with the slogan, jobs not jails, jobs for a future. But it really, over the last 3 decades, has evolved into a therapeutic and community of what we say irresistible, tender love, a culture in which we love each other. And we say that. Every call that I get, no matter what, ends with, I love you, I see you, and we see each other, and we laugh from the belly. There is despair, and there is pain, and there is trauma, and we stand together to be hopeful for each other, to restore faith in human beings, and to say that together that we have a way and a pathway out. So we're a one-stop center that offers everything you can imagine, from tattoo removal services, case management. We have about 50 classes, different classes, from anger management to parenting, everything you can imagine that someone needs. But I would say what sets us apart at Homeboy is not resources, but it's this idea that we connect people to people first. And then the help and the resources are second, because relationships heal. And it is in that relationship that we see opportunity and hope, and have built really a movement of restoring each other and healthy communities, and then breaking the cycle of pain, poverty, violence, when we commit to the idea that we have to stop throwing people away. And so that's really, we can talk a little bit more of what we do, but in terms of resources, we have also what I would say 9 social enterprises where we still employ people, but healing is first and primary. And the job is really purposeful activity. It's about meaning, it's about connection, and it's about belonging to each other in community and building together. And that's how we sort of begin to transform each other's identities and evolve together.
Thank you so much. Really important point. No hopeful kid ever joins a gang, and really no hopeful kid ever, not ever, but when children have hope, they will not necessarily move towards a violent life, shooting, in their schools, et cetera. So it is very true in regard to what is offered in these programs. So thank you so much. All right. Rabad Mayoub is the executive director of A Common Word Among Youth, which is also known as ACWE. He is also the CEO of the World Humanitarian Action Forum, a non-governmental organization based in London. And the WHAF's main objective is to support local and national NGOs in 3 key areas: capacity exchange, collaboration, and advocacy. WHAF recently launched its Reshaping Aid Agenda in 2030 to continue and address the need for change in the aid system with local NGOs at the center. Thank you, Rabad, for being here.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the invitation. Just a slight correction. I'm no longer the CEO of the Humanitarian Forum.
Oh, okay.
Yes, that was about a year ago now, so it's relatively recent. That's my humanitarian development work. So I probably have 3 hats on right now on this panel. So I'm a humanitarian development worker, part-time. If there is a part-time role in humanitarian work. And I'm also the director of A Common Word Among the Youth, and that looks at involving and engaging young people in the interfaith sector, providing them opportunities to be at the table and to be heard on the topic of peace building, and using faith as a way to share experiences, but also to demonstrate the role and the impact of faith in building peaceful societies. In terms of related to the topic of restorative justice and gang culture, if I can use that term, I'll probably have to go back about 10 or 15 years to my previous role, where I worked with young people predominantly, but also adults in the drugs industry. So I was a drugs worker raising awareness about the impacts of drugs in schools, in places of worship like mosques and madrasas, and also treating drug users and raising awareness in outreach in the streets. And of course, often there is a correlation, differs in different places, between drugs and gangs and crime. And maybe I can share some examples later on, but I think the key for us, I think, is, whether you look at gangs or groups, communities, there's a sense of belonging that people are looking for. There's a sense of identity. There is an element of, there's a vacuum in people being accepted and being loved for who they are and what they believe in. And I think that's maybe some of the common themes that we might address on this topic. But I'm actually looking forward to listening to some of the experts on the table on the issue of gang culture in particular, and how faith-based projects and programs support people who are involved in these activities and those who are coming out of those sort of activities and out of prison. So I'm eager to learn from those around the table on my left and right, up-to-date sort of ways in working with and helping and supporting people who unfortunately have, sometimes no fault of their own, have been subjected to certain environments and pressures to get involved in some of these activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Bishop Juan de Dios Peña. He is the Representative Council of Evangelical Methodist Churches of Latin America and the Caribbean. That is a mouthful. Bishop Peña studied at the Law School of Pan American University in El Salvador with theological formation in the Latin American Biblical University in Costa Rica and the Curse of Studies with Claremont School of Theology. I also went there too, got my Doctor of Ministry. He is part of the General Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church, a pastor of several different churches, and an ordained elder of the United Methodist Church of El Salvador. Welcome, Bishop Peña.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's a privilege for me to be here, and thank you. Well, coming from El Salvador, you will hear by decades so many bad news about the country, and we have been working very hard that El Salvador is not only a place of bad news, but also of good news. But it has been a difficult challenge. Anyway, one of the reasons because the church got involved in so many social activities, it has been because we found that many people were leaving the country every day. And that has been from generations to generations, since the wartime, back in the 80s, a war that lasted for 12 years and took the life of more than 80,000 people during those 12 years. Many Salvadorians left the country trying to keep them safe from the violence that we experience. In our country, we experience a pedagogy of violence for so many people involved, government, army, police, and now also gangs. But the work that the church has been doing has been very, very difficult. But also when we found that many people were leaving the country and trying to come to the US or somewhere else, we tried to identify for what reason the people were leaving the country. And we found that many of the people that left the country, they were already trying hard to keep them safe around the country. They were internal force displaced people. I live in a town called Ahuachapán, which is just 25 minutes away from the Guatemalan border. So we see very often a lot of human trafficking and drug trafficking, and also many other challenges. But for being in a place where I live, we start seeing that many people were moving from San Salvador area to the capital to this area just to try to find a new place to live. But the challenge was that when people were coming to these new places, they don't find a sense of community. When they get sick, they go to the hospitals or to the medical clinics run by the government, and they were not being treated because their ID, their number doesn't apply to be seen in a Huachapan area. So they have to go back to the place where they used to live. Also, the students were not admitted into the schools because they may be gang members. They may be related to the gangs. So they didn't have the opportunity to continue to education. And also, so for those reasons and for many others, people weren't able to find the sense of community. So the church has been running different ministries, and one that we have been doing is we open a medical clinic to treat people, and especially this kind of people that were marginalized. And also, we open a school. We started with 18 children that some of their parents were already involved in the gangs, just trying to do a prevention program, actually start like an after-school program, but it becomes a very interesting ministry. And now we have 538 students. From those 538 students, 110, they have come from somewhere else inside the country because they have been forced displaced. And 22 of them right now, their parents are in prison at this new exceptional moment that we're living in the country where we don't have constitutional guarantees. We don't have a legal system in place protecting the rights of people. Also, 29 students are related to the gangs. Somehow we have been able to interact with the gangs to be able to give to the kids a different opportunity that they experience. Because you can talk to them, and you can also provide a place for them to have a different experience. Not with all of them is the same reality, but with some of them it's possible to have those kinds of conversations and bring the kids to our school. Also, sometimes we're able to build houses for families that they don't find a place to go to live. And through the church, the ministry of the church, to worship, not only through the Methodist Church, but with other churches and organizations, we try to develop a sense of community, because also the gangs provide a community experience. The gangs, they also give you a place where you can feel important yourself, and also where you can show some power as well, in some respects, and people is looking for those things as well, especially young people. So those are the kind of things we're doing, and the displaced and for the forced displaced people not only are displaced by the gangs, but also by the police, by the army. The gangs are making people to run away, but also the police is making gangs run away, but also the army is making regular citizens to run away. So it's a very challenging situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. As you've all been speaking, I've been thinking just about restorative processes in general, and transformative justice and restorative justice, and however we want to phrase it. And I appreciate the work that's happening within the gang communities, but also the importance of restorative practices outside of prison. There are so many other examples of restorative processes working throughout the world. Some of the case studies I really appreciate are the Amish school shooting in Pennsylvania, when Carl Roberts walked into the school and killed 5 children. Later on that evening, and then he was killed himself. Later on that evening, the Amish community was bringing food to Carl Roberts' wife. The next morning, Carl Roberts' wife was sitting at the table having coffee with the families whose husband had killed their children. That is an amazing example of grace and reconciliation and restorative practices that are deep and many times humans find absolutely impossible to recognize the divine in those cases. A personal situation for me, when my daughter was a junior in high school, there was a stabbing in her school. We lived in a very affluent white community in Massachusetts, and so there was never any kind of violence. And so a young man walked into school that day with the intention of killing somebody, and he did. He stabbed a young man named James Allenson, and James died on the floor of the high school. Later on that day, I reached out to both of the families. I had just started studying restorative justice when I was getting my second master's, and not a single family from my church, not a single family from Sudbury, except for one, would actually go visit the Odgrins, whose son had committed the crime. Nobody wanted to go see this family. It was myself and one other person who went to visit the Odgrins, because the reality is that James Allenson died that day, but the Odgrins also lost their son that day. So restorative processes are something that work in many, many different frameworks. And I just wanted to offer this quote before we go into our guiding questions to give a sense more of how restorative processes work. This is from Justice is Healing Indigenous Ways by Wanda McCaslin. Restorative justice offers a philosophical and theoretical worldviews for looking at crime and wrongdoing. The theoretical framework provides a way to organize how we think, feel, and see. The restorative justice theory guides our processes and actions while also helping us understand the processes by clarifying the concepts, principles, and values on which they are based. Restorative justice philosophy incorporates some core values and principles. It is a harm-centered and need-centered approach to a criminal act which is thought of as harm to individuals, their property, their relationships, and their communities. It is inclusive and encourages the active participation of those with direct interest. Values such as accountability, open communication, caring, empathy, responsibility, compassion, fairness, respect, transformation, reparation, healing, and the empowerment are key to the process. It's a lot involved. Moreover, restorative justice processes take into consideration the whole context of the situation. So we're going to move on to just having each of our panelists answer a question specifically related to kind of restorative processes. So the first question is for Shirley. Why are restorative and reconciliatory practices imperative to social justice work within marginalized communities?
There's so many things that are coming up as I'm hearing everyone share, and I think at the center of this is the idea that we don't throw people away, and that we have the opportunity that in restoring and helping and being committed to restoration and faith in people, we restore a deeper and host a deeper part of ourselves as a community. And so at Homeboy, we say there is no us and them, there's just us. And we have to be committed to each other's healing if we want to be well as a community. We have examples, not just across the United States, but across the world, of this idea that punishing wound never works. It's never moved the needle on crime. It's never made anyone feel safer. We understand that people have to pay time for whatever crime they've committed, but that there's an opportunity to restore and break the cycle of pain, as you've said. So I think at the center of that, we have to stay committed to a practice, but also, for me, it's important that this practice is always an invitation, that anything that we commit to that is about healing and restoration is really about inviting each other to the conversation and the opportunity that healing and mending is possible. And I have really a strong belief that when it's mandated, nothing mandated works because it's about expectation. It contributes to a cycle of trauma and saying that you are sorry and really pleasing for the sake of being whole. But the deeper work is about an invitation to wholeness. And this idea that until we're all well, none of us are well. And for us at Homeboy Industries, we've committed to that practice, and we meet people where they are, and we believe in dosage. So we understand that the process is a lifetime in many cases. And everyone gets a dose. We've stayed over the last 20 years that I've been there, committed and loyal to serve severe violent offenders. So if someone comes in and we know that they have a chance and they have an opportunity to be part of a school in which they can graduate in a regular school, or they could be successful and hold the job, our folks will help them through those concrete practices. But we really stand with those whose doors and who've been really demonized and not allowed into regular schools, have never held a job, have never been part of, because we believe that's where our healing is and our commitment is. And we learn in that way that when we invite people, it becomes about having more choices. And when we invite them to those practices, there's then a ripple effect that impacts their children. It's an invitation to look at not only the harm that they have caused, but an invitation to recognize themselves as being victims first. And that's important, because understanding trauma and understanding story and providing a sanctuary in which people feel safe enough to take off their armor and the masks and the characters that have quote unquote protected them their whole lives is, I think, the first step in really truly being committed to a restorative practice. And something the bishop said when he talked about gang and gang membership and gang culture is that it is true. I've heard so many homeboys and homegirls say, they joined a gang because they were seeking family, or they were seeking love, or they were seeking a way in which to be part of. But they also say that when they were incarcerated or when they were abandoned. And so one of the things I've learned at Homeboys is the community trumps gangs, and gangs provide a kind of conditional love that is temporary. And what you want to create is a kind of unconditional love that says no matter what, there's nothing you can do where anyone here as part of this movement will ever leave your side. And we have a saying, Father Greg has always taught us, it's like, I'm with you till the wheels fall off. There's nothing you can do. And so in that way, we stay committed to the process that doesn't have a start or an end, but is about how we're all committed to this invitation to understand that we have more choices and chances than we can imagine, and that we also want to challenge our own notions of enemy. And I think that's among the many things that I've learned at Homeboy, is this idea that there is such a thing as enemy and or other. And as we look even at in our sort of healthy systems, we, in the time I've been at Homeboy, I think about our relationship with law enforcement and how we've been at odds and how that's changed over time as we've understood, if we are committed to public safety and restoration and peace building, then we have to walk together. And there is no us and them, there's just us.
Thank you so much. So many important points you made, especially just about breaking that cycle and not demonizing and really seeing everyone for their humanity. And as you were talking too, I was thinking that there's so many things that play into why people join gangs or why they commit crimes or why they end up where they end up. And I tutored women in prison at FCI Dublin. That's the Federal Correctional Institute in Dublin, California. And many of the women that I tutored were getting their GED. And the stories they told me, almost all of the stories were the same. They were in school, they couldn't read very well or at all. The teachers gave up on them. They would get passed from grade to grade to grade to grade. By the time they got to high school, they were angry. They had no desire to be in school because they couldn't read, and nobody would help them. Nobody would give them the time that they needed. Nobody welcomed them or made them feel like they were worthwhile. And so they dropped out of high school, started gangbanging, started selling drugs, ended up in prison. And so there's a system to that, as we know, as the school to prison pipeline, that is consistently, the system is consistently playing into why we have this occurring all around the world, and as well as here in the United States and Central America. So thank you. Bishop Pena, how can faith communities strive to break the recidivism cycle and to address the collateral consequences of formerly gang-involved people?
Something that is very sad is that in our country, the gangs are being seen like evil. They are being demonized. And our president, almost every day, he type in Twitter saying something like that, and it creates a sense of hate against the gangs, very bad, like they should be in prison or dead. So for the church, it's very important to see that they still having the image of God, because they are creation of God, they are creatures of God. And not everything is lost. Every single person have an opportunity to restore their life and to see a different reality in the future. The church is a very interesting organization, institution, or family, because very often we do the mistake that we see those problems with a spiritual cosmovision. And we think that to change somebody's life or to transform somebody's life is only like something spiritually and magic. And sometimes we don't realize that this is a work that we have to do together. Church, institutions, organizations, government, community, and also the people that are involved in gangs. They also need to be aware of what they want to do is to change their lives. Also, something that the church has to be careful as well is that the gangs that we can reach them, they don't find in the church that we also disposable. We also dispose, or like the gangs can be disposable, because sometimes in the dynamics of churches, sometimes also we can dispose people. Especially they come from an experience of being disposable sometimes. Opportunities. The church is also a space to providing a sense of family, of love, compassion, and opportunities of belonging, to feel themselves as important. I see so many kids that especially teenagers, that they are already getting involved in gangs, and as they get so involved in other activities in churches or in the community, just being busy and finding a new way to see things, you can see that some good things can happen around them as well. Even that there are so many other challenges that when they go back to their houses or to their community, they still experience the same problems. So it is important also for us to realize that not everything is spiritual, but also psychosocial, emotional, and that is an important thing to consider, to try to find holistic ways to work with them. We are not lone rangers. We have to work together in order to be able to impact people's life. And not because we are experts, but because in our Christian practice, in our spiritual practice, we think that we can restore the image of God in every human being.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And then the idea of humans being disposable is something that is, I believe, people who approach this topic in a way that is not trying to understand is, just very demonizing and dehumanizing. And you're right. And some people do walk through the door who are experiencing that feeling from their homes and their families as well. And again, that is why, hurt people hurt people. And so thank you for those points. Appreciate it. Rafael, what strategic initiatives have you found work to create understanding of why people in marginalized communities live in violent neighborhoods and often end up in gang members and or in prison? I know that's a long sentence. You want me to turn the computer so you can look at it? Yeah, it's this one.
Okay. Maybe I'll take a little bit of I agree with a lot of what was said, especially from Bishop regarding the sort of idiosyncrasies of El Salvador. But I'll just maybe respond with a sort of, when we talk about strategic, right, initiatives, and be a bit more maybe political in what I'm going to say. I think a lot of what we're doing now is to sort of create a space for restorative justice practice to actually happen. So, I think one of the greatest lessons of El Salvador for the region is that violence doesn't go away with the end of conflict, formal conflict. It mutates, right? And so El Salvador has this history of violence mutation. And just to sort of start off with an anecdote, as the bishop said, we have this state of exception in El Salvador, which has led to over 2% of the population being imprisoned. So it's a really sort of misanthropic context that we live in. And people are being arbitrarily detained. The government makes no qualms about going after not just gang members, but their social base, their family members, their grandmothers. You have children as young as 12 being detained. And I was in a meeting when a pastor called me when his halfway house, which is one of the most successful programs, has worked with UNDP, it's worked with USAID, it's worked with the Salvadoran government. It's one of the most successful halfway houses and therapeutic spaces in El Salvador. It was raided by the police, and they took everybody. Luckily, we were able to intervene, and they didn't take the pastor. But it was, when I saw him in the house, he was completely, he's crying. He was completely desolate. And it became clear as well that, we can do a lot of these sort of practical projects, which are really important. But as long as that, sort of cynical political class is able to tap into this rhetoric of demonization, you can spend years building up local projects that are very successful, and the government can destroy it in a matter of half an hour. And I've seen that many times. So I think a lot of, so for me, one of the most important things that we're doing now is to sort of is to provide a certain level of religious competency when it comes to how do we talk about crime? How do we talk about violence? A lot of religious communities don't know how to talk about crime, and they actually add to the demonization. There are a lot of, that's definitely has happened in El Salvador. The base of Bukele's base is also, he has a strong religious base of voters. But even when you look at places like like Brazil and Bolsonaro, this level of sort of religious fundamentalism that adds wood to the fire in terms of demonizing the other is very strong. So for me, a lot of what we've been doing is to say, okay, there are deep political implications for how, if religious communities are able to have that language to talk about humanizing the other. And so a lot of what we're doing is basically trying to create the conditions for pastors and interreligious folk to be able to have a counter narrative to mano dura or iron fist policing, and that is the sort of indispensable condition that we need in order to move things forward. So as far as strategic, what we do is we kind of have three guiding principles in our project. One is that it's community focused, not individual. So a lot of the projects in El Salvador have to do with sort of religious proselytizing, right? You have to convert to Christianity in order to leave the gang. And a lot of churches use that. I mean, this only contributes, I think, to actually to the problem in many ways, because you cannot create sort of like a credible political policy around security that's based on religious piety, right? That doesn't. You're not humanizing the other. You're just having them come to your side. So a lot of what we do is sort of, all right, the focus about when we talk about reentry, formerly incarcerated people, especially gang members, it's not an individual focus. It's really about the community, creating the conditions within the community and their families to receive them. The other is that it's ecumenical interreligious. No church can do it on their own. And you know, the word ecumenical in Latin America, especially in El Salvador, is a pejorative. You know, people think they don't like to work together. So it's already difficult to do ecumenical work, but to do interreligious work is really important, I think, as well, because, as I said before, there is this link, there is a sort of confluence of multiple fundamentalisms that happen, religious, political, economic, and allowing all of these communities that are trying to do good work for them to sit down with a rabbi or an imam is a big deal. And so it breaks down those barriers, and I think it really, that sort of interreligious component is really important to the work. And then the other is this idea of creating a new language to talk about the other. We're very much indebted to Father Greg and to Homeboy Industries for providing a new language to talk about this sort of marginality. So really for us, it's really trying to humanize. How is it possible that in a place like El Salvador, the government incarcerates people and no te duele? I mean, it doesn't hurt you to see the government just sort of arbitrarily detaining all these people, mistreating them, putting them essentially in concentration camps, and people applaud that. You know, we have a lot of work to do to humanize the other. And for me, that really has to do with creating this moral imagination, and I think that's the role. That's what I was referring to before when I said that the role of religious communities is crucial, because without religious communities being stakeholders and rethinking security, we're never going to get anywhere. And so you have to break this dichotomy. You have to provide people with a language that's not just us against them or victimizer. It's much more complex than that. So that would be my contribution.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Obviously very important, the political context of all of this, and it's so layered and there's so much involved. So really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Rawad, when implemented, how do restorative and reconciliatory practices build more beloved communities?
Right, so that's a very deep question. And I'm not, I would say, a very thoughtful person. I don't do deep thinking. I'm a practical person. I like to go into the wild. I'm a sportsman, and I don't like to ponder too much, except when I'm in prayer, of course. So let me take a step back, actually, if I may. And I guess, because we have to be real. I mean, we have to be, frank and honest with ourselves and with each other. The term restorative justice, we can't forget the word justice in that as well. And of course, the victim, as well as the perpetrator, as well as the one who's committed the crime. We have to always remember the victim as well. And sometimes, in trying to help and support others, we tend to maneuver more towards the person we're helping, forgetting that there's a victim in all of this. And it's not about who should be at the center. Should it be the victim, or should it be the one who's committed the crime? As we said, it's not a case of us or them. So I think I just want to, again, bring us back to, in terms of, being honest and truth to ourselves. If anybody's been involved or has been at the other end of a particular crime, in gangs and guns and crime, etc., then, we have to be asking ourselves, what would we do in that scenario? And we know there's lots of good examples. But at the end of the day, there is an element in our faiths and traditions of reward and punishment, hell and heaven. And in this life as well, we have that element. And I think, in terms of the rule of law, it helps to run a society and to continue maintaining peace and safety and security in societies. I come from, I was born in Yemen and I lived in England, but I'm back now living in Yemen again. And, it's a war-torn country, but let's not get into the politics of it. But, your average Yemeni is I won't say armed to the teeth, it's exaggerating a little bit, but is probably about 1 to 3 weapons per household, right? But you don't see the gang crime and the mass shootings that you see elsewhere. And again, that's to do a lot with faith, culture, and traditions. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have to look back at and it's case by case basis, and obviously it depends on certain contexts and countries, but the victim is also involved in the fight for justice, in that process. And in some traditions and cultures, it's actually the victim that decides, what might be the punishment, if there should be a punishment. And, in certain traditions, it is advised that, or it is better to forgive where possible. And that person will be rewarded for forgiving, forgiving the perpetrator of the crime. So I think it's important to just remember that. But going to the question and looking at building beloved communities when implementing these programs. And again, this is an interreligious program, and we're talking about faith-based programs. So I think it's important to look at the added value that faiths and traditions and religions bring to the table in this line of work. And I think 2 big key words that begin with F, the 2 F words, family and faith, are very important. And I think, and with that comes identity, with that comes the love and the sense of belonging that can be restored to the individual or the group and the community. And again, as I said earlier, often some of the, if you like, I don't like to use this word, root causes, or some of the factors that may lead people and individuals to drugs or gangs is, lack of opportunity, but also the need to belong, to have a sense of acceptance from others. And faith and family can be one of those ways out, or bringing people back in. And I think faith and traditions have a lot to offer in that regard, and providing that sense of belonging and the love that people are short of, maybe in certain areas. So I think, and once we have that in a beloved community, then the sort of positive consequences of that is that then people are able to then move on and get on, and be an example for others, because it's always easy to be critical of the system, the justice system, and rightly so in a lot of places. But also we have to look at our system from an individual level, from the family level, and the community level. What system are we putting in place in how we treat others and how we see those who are involved in gangs and drugs and crime. Yes, we mustn't forget the victim and the need to pursue justice, but also better to forgive and forget, and be an example for others in trying to build safe but beloved communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you brought up a very important point. Every faith tradition, every indigenous tradition on the planet has in their theological framework the notion of restorative practices, the notion of forgiveness, the notion of reconciliation in every faith tradition and indigenous tradition. And in fact, the restorative justice kind of view that we have now that we are working in, the framework that we work in, if you will, in the Western world, has stemmed from the Maori community in New Zealand. And so I proved all of this in my doctoral thesis. So it's very real, and it's there, and we can read it and we can practice it, and it's a choice. And it's, again, as you mentioned, Road, how we're raised and how our faith affects us and how we move through the world. So thank you so much to all of you. So we're going to move into about, I don't know, maybe between 10 and 15 minutes of an interactive discussion. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure you all have a lot of questions of each other. So if anybody would like to start and has a question of one of our, esteemed colleagues, I would love to have one of you start and ask whoever of us a question that you might have. I could start, but if anybody has one ready to go, I would love to hear what you have to say. Shirley?
More than a question, I think a thought, as I heard folks, is kind of like what's required. Like, I almost think about a paradigm shift. And particularly when you come from poverty, scarcity, you sort of grow up in a world that's unpredictable and unsafe, and that shapes who you are in the world in some ways, through family. But I think a lot, and I've been thinking a lot with this notion of like freedom and liberation, and how some of us who come to the work who've never been locked up are truly not free and liberated. That there is a healing, and working with marginalized and gang members in particularly has made me a better human being. But what I've learned in the process is that I also had healing, and it required a paradigm shift. It requires a paradigm shift and a commitment to abundance, and that forgiveness is not about waiting for an apology, and perhaps even that it's not about forgiveness, but perhaps mercy, and that then mercy leads us to the kind of joy that God would like us to rejoice and fight in. And for me, that's why, for me, being part of this work, being part of a community like Homeboys feels like heaven on earth. But as I was hearing all of you speak, I was thinking about what's required. And it is this imagination to abundance, and it is a surrendering to the limitations that we all grow up with about what's possible. And that's important because, again, we all come from there's not enough. And even in some of our practices, you have to catch yourself slipping into judgment, and I think a lot about how the homies check me all the time. You say about you're this, that, and that, but you're busy being busy and not present. And that matters to me, and that's what has transformed my life. And so I'm just curious about, for everyone here, is how maybe this work is tied to your own healing and your own.
Anybody want to answer that?
Okay, I'll have a quick stab at that. So again, another deep question. Well, I had a lot of misconceptions and perceptions of drug users when I started my line of work in the drugs industry. And I did a lot of learning and reflective learning and coming to understanding my perceptions and misconceptions. So, and like you said, I learned a lot more than I could give. So I did a lot of learning. But yeah, absolutely. I think, again, I like to be realistic. I mean, if we want to be forgiven, nobody's free of sin. So, we like to be forgiven. We want to be forgiven. And so if we can't forgive, then how do we expect to be forgiven? And I think, with the drugs work that I was involved in, one thing that helped us in the project is, the senior drugs worker was an ex-drug addict of 10 years. And I couldn't get my head around, surely it's easy to just, stop using drugs. I mean, just surely it's in the mind. It's just that easy, isn't it? Just you don't want to use drugs if you don't want to be part of a gang. Isn't it just a a strong internal true decision that one makes, if they know that it's wrong. And I took time to get my head around that. And one of the things he said to me was that, look, it can take a split second or minute or two to become addicted to drugs, or to start using drugs at least. Certain drugs obviously are stronger than others, and I don't get into the physiological elements of drug use. But somebody who's been using drugs for 7-10 years might take 7 to 10 years to fully recover from drug use. So, and understanding there's a lot of factors that contribute to, people being involved or getting involved in these activities, whether it's drugs or gang culture. And a lot of it, like I say, it's the society, the system, the pressures of the environment, lack of opportunities, poverty, and where, I think there's another topic, where people are positioned or placed in terms of the living and housing opportunities. So again, it's really about, for me, understanding how does my faith help me to understand my role in society, and also to help others, and then therefore, for those who are involved in crimes and gang culture, and again, I don't want to generalize here because gang culture is a big term. What does that mean? There are people who are involved in certain gangs. I mean, what forms a gang? But again, we don't have time to go into that. So some would say a particular group would be a gang, but not getting involved in crime. So it's not all related necessarily. But let me end with this. I think for me, it's about ensuring that we do a lot of learning in the process, and also being ready to forgive. We don't always have to forget, but it's good to forgive. And I like the word mercy. It's because, and the problem with the word mercy though is it has negative connotations. When you're being merciful to somebody, it's as if they are requiring and needing your acceptance for them that what they did was wrong, and therefore you are now being merciful to them. But it's an interesting word nonetheless. Anyway, I'm babbling on, but I think it's a very deep question. And again, I don't do deep questions, as you can hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rawad. What I was thinking is kind of what you just said, Shirley, is I worked at St. Anthony's also in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which is the most underserved neighborhood in San Francisco. And there are a lot of things happening on the streets there, a lot of homelessness, a lot of addiction, people dying every day on the street. And for me, it was almost 3 years of learning and growing as a human being, and really just trying to understand how people can be hurting so much to find themselves in that place of despair. And I just appreciated every lesson I received from my work in the Tenderloin, and also from my work when I was volunteering in the prison. Is they were teachers. I was there to tutor them, but those women taught me more than I will ever have learned in a classroom or reading a book. So I appreciate that lesson in just understanding the complexities of being human. Thank you. Any other questions for each other? I know we must have other questions for each other.
Well, I think I have a question. Let's see. As we work with people that have experienced violence in their life, and especially with the work with the gangs, or with former gang members, or current gang members, my question is, in the work you guys do, how deep you go in the relationship, in the sense of community and supporting them? Because sometimes there are very dangerous lines that cannot be crossed, or maybe they need to be crossed, I don't know. But I'm curious, and how deep you guys go in these relationships?
Yeah, no, it's a complicated question for sure because yeah, working with gangs is very idiosyncratic and can be very complicated. And in places like El Salvador, you can easily go to prison for asociación ilícita, right? So just there are laws. I mean, one of the problems in El Salvador, the recent gang violence has grown and basically gotten out of control is in large part because you know you've made it very difficult for the gang to leave the gang, and intervention, for example, is illegal. You can't do gang intervention. So for a long time, like the private sector has said, well, yeah, without a reentry law, I can't hire gang members or former gang members, or you know, a lot of religious actors will say, yeah, of course, I'm sympathetic to what you guys want to do, but I also don't want to go to prison. I mean, I know several pastors that have gone to prison for working with gang members. So it becomes extremely difficult. And with Bukele, it's even more difficult, right? Because we really don't know exactly where this is all going. One of the things we've been working on for many years is a reentry law, which basically creates a sort of legal framework for what is an ex-gang member. And that's sort of kind of what we need in El Salvador, because you have all of these legislation, anti-gang legislation that makes it really difficult to actually work with them. But so just to say that I think El Salvador has, it's a very complicated gang landscape, which is, I mean, LA, I think we've learned so much from LA, but also El Salvador has unique challenges for sure that make that relationship just difficult in legal terms. And definitely not trying to end up in jail myself. So it's hard. But in terms of being connected, I mean, maybe I'm connecting Shirley's question and the bishop's question, but you know, I always think back. I mean, the work with gangs, I think, has really also helped me to rediscover my own faith tradition. I'm Catholic, but you know, when Jesus is on the cross, he's flanked by two criminals. You know, he goes into paradise with gang members, right? And sort of, it's a big part of our theology that we have got sort of forgotten, right? And I think my relationship is pretty strong with a lot of these members. You know, I mean, I spent the last 2 days before I got on the flight, I was in Mariona dropping off, you know, hygiene kits for gang members. There are lots of gang members who are in, I mean, hopefully this is not being, is this translated? Is this being transmitted live or something? Yeah, so no, there's, you know, you're trying to work with members and you're crossing lines a lot, right? Trying to say, okay, well, people trying to reform their lives, you know, you care for them. And I think so I would say that you know, I've learned a lot from them. I care about them. I go a long way, but, and I think the intervention is the relationship that you have, right? In the end, it's obviously, you know, you go to Homeboy and you have these wraparound services and you guys have developed this amazing methodology, but when you boil it down, it is that relationship that you have. And so we definitely tried, I definitely feel like I try to do that, but I would say the big obstacle in El Salvador is just literally being in this very difficult political context that makes that infinitely more, the risks are much greater.
Mm-hmm.
I would say we go deep. I'm looking at my phone. I have my badge from yesterday's ER visit. And no matter, I think when people are most vulnerable, you need to show up when they are alone and isolated. It matters to show up because people will remember that you were there. And when we say we're with you no matter what, we believe that. And I also, for me, like the homies are my trustworthy companions. I trust them. They will tell me if we're not in a safe place. Boundaries are important. I do believe in boundaries. We try to talk to our teams. You know, we employ 360, right now we have 360 trainees in what we call our 18-month model. So we employ people for their first job, and their first job is to work on themselves. They have a team of case managers, peer navigators who are graduates of our program, who now hold the door open for the next person, mental health therapists, and then we have their supervisors where they do their work. So we say the first job is relational accountability. So the relationship is what matters. And then they learn the on-the-job stuff. But for me, no matter what my role, proximity to the process matters, because again, it's you keep your eyes fresh, and we go deep, and we have an open door policy, and we are interrupted at every meeting in ways that are not normal at Homeboy. Like, I can be in a meeting and people will just walk in and want to show me that they got their driver's license and that they can legitimately drive a car in Los Angeles for the first time ever. And that has to do with identity and belonging and seeing me. And that's so appropriate. And we wanna yearn for those interruptions, because we wanna be like the parents that didn't show up, who light up when the child walks into the room. We wanna be able to, rather than see folks for their deficits, be present and have these rich opportunities to make amends, to help mend things and build healthy relationships that then open them up to trust more people and change their perception of the world and their place in it. And so it matters to show up, but it also, place matters and sanctuary matters. So I'm not naive. We pay attention, like the magic doesn't just happen. We don't pray our way into, like, let's hope nothing happens today, particularly as we move out of this pandemic. If we're moving, we've seen a kind of despair, hopelessness, and survival in our communities of color in Los Angeles that has brought crimes and homicides to an unprecedented level. I mean, we've gone back 15 years, and what we're seeing, homicides are up 50%. We have opioid use and synthetic drugs hitting, and we're seeing it as they come through the door. And what's important for us is to continue to figure out, how do we connect? How do we have a place that is safe? And we have a team that helps us understand temperature. So we say at Homeboy, we don't check the box, we check the pulse. What does that mean? We're paying attention to how many people we have from each neighborhood. We are making sure that our peer navigators, that our staff is engaging, and making sure that people that are enemies are working together, that the norms that are out in the world and in systems that separate folks by color, that they're breaking bread together, that there's rituals, that we're building tables where everyone can sit at. So everything's about intentionality and attention to how are we providing sanctuary and safety in a way that our community has never been afforded, and then that's reciprocated. And so when things are not safe, the people will tell us, pay attention to this. We also are, I think Greg in his first 10 years did a lot of outreach and was in neighborhoods and was doing peace treaties, and he said he'll never do that again. We don't do outreach. We are at a place where we know everyone needs help, but we can only help people that want to be helped. And that's different. So we don't try to convince people. We wait for them at the door with open arms when they're ready. And this is why we have 12,000 folks walk through our doors seeking a chance for that. So we do go deep, but we have boundaries, and we have the conversations about what are the conditions to keep us safe. And that's evolved, and it's gotten more challenging in the pandemic when everyone is operating from a place of fear and pain in unprecedented ways. And Homeboy is the opposite, in trying to stay grounded in this abundance of love and no matter what.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, well, it's time to move into, we have a few minutes for question and answer from our audience. Is there anybody, and I would like to also just introduce, we have lovely woman here, Aisha, and she is actually part of the Homeboy program and is now assistant to the CEO, Tom Vazzo. So is willing to perhaps, if anybody has any questions for her as a participant of Homeboy and as a part of the program, feel free to also ask Aisha any questions, or you can catch her after this and maybe she can answer something. All right, we're glad you're here, Aisha, thank you. Any questions from the audience? There.
So much for your beautiful presentations. I'm so inspired to know that you're willing to do the kind of work you're doing in the face of what seemed like insurmountable obstacles. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on what seems like here in Los Angeles another insurmountable obstacle is our homelessness crisis and people who are being disposed, and how we're trying to solve it in the government from the top down, and it's not working. And it seems like this model of building the beloved communities, these people who are living on the street, they're lacking community, they need love. How to apply this kind of idea in this particular crisis, the idea of building beloved community.
I can speak to that if anybody, because I worked with homeless and unhoused, and I also worked at Habitat for Humanity, and I agree that these programs could definitely, this type of approach can definitely work. Personally, from my experience working, like I said, at St. Anthony's with the unhoused, there's so much involved. There's food security, there's mental health, there's addiction, there's broken families, there's abuse, domestic violence. I mean, it's overwhelming because there's so much happening with those who are experiencing also loss of jobs, you know, in regard to why people become homeless in the first place. The reality is once somebody is homeless, it's about 4 months before they start using. If they're on the street longer than 4 months, they're going to start using. And so it's so entrenched and it's so difficult. What I found when I was working with both at Habitat for Humanity and St. Anthony's is that first we need to get people into homes and into any kind of shelter whatsoever. And so what we did at Habitat was we worked with the city of San Jose, and they built emergency sleeping cabins. And that created a sense of community. We brought in services, but you can't just offer a home. You have to offer the services, the mental health, the job training, access to a computer. You have to have a kitchen. You have to have bathrooms, a shower. I mean, it's so involved. And I don't have an answer in regard to how that all works holistically and to help such a massive problem such as here in LA, and it's the same up in the Bay Area as well. But what I can say is that there is a demonization as well of people who are unhoused. The reality is, and what I used to say when I would go, I was faith partnerships manager, so I would go out and work with faith communities on volunteerism and donations. And one of the things I would always say is we're all literally one paycheck away from being homeless. And we experienced that with COVID, is, you know, suddenly people didn't have food, they didn't have a home, they couldn't pay their rent. And again, though, kind of what we do in this work is that community, those faith communities stepped up and they fed people and they created tents, you know, they gave tents out. I actually had a tent campaign. I wouldn't want anybody to sleep in a tent, but I would rather have seen somebody in a tent on the street in the Tenderloin than outside. And so I think it's the way it's viewed. I know especially the unhoused in San Francisco, especially in the Tenderloin, are demonized. It is looked upon as, you know, they're dirty, they're addicts, they're junkies. The reality is, though, is that we all know somebody who is addicted. We all know somebody who is a functioning addict. And those people can be CEOs and movie stars and rock stars, or they can be that person who's shooting up on the corner of, you know, Jones and Golden Gate in San Francisco. And so for me, the beloved community is recognizing, again, the humanity of everyone, regardless of where they live, how they live, what they're doing with their lives. and showing them the compassion and empathy that everyone deserves. I think there's a lot of policy that has to change. And for us, as we do this work with gangs, Father Greg has done an insurmountable amount of work in policy and with the city of Los Angeles. And so there always is one person that's a catalyst. And so perhaps you could be that catalyst, Swamiji, here in LA. No pressure, though. But, you know, there has to be a community that stands up, especially faith communities, and just rallies around the people who really, really need help. And I don't know if there's a better answer from anybody else at this table, but that's just kind of how I feel. I could go on and on, but it's because it's so layered and there's so much going on.
Very quickly, I think it's a state responsibility. I mean, let's just be honest. You know, nobody should be sleeping on the streets. You know, the state, the country, the government should have a strong enough welfare system to provide housing for everyone. And you know, the civil society is providing so much and doing so much, and we can't do everything. And homelessness is a big issue in the UK where I live. And I think first and foremost, the responsibility stops at the state and the country level.
I echo the same thing, is that we first have to recognize it's a man-made problem. And until we acknowledge that, then we're just pointing fingers and can't get to a solution. The opposite of addiction is connection. And so I also think about, while we're waiting for the state to, there's countries who really believe in not leaving anyone behind. And it's particularly in Los Angeles out there, I don't understand how we can look past, you know, and continue to build buildings without connection. There's a concrete example. The county built housing for, I believe, 134 folks behind a forge, behind Homeboy Industries. But there's an absence of like people, connection, there's not community. So you can build buildings to house people, but if you don't build the village and the community, then people are still disconnected. Then people have places where they can continue to be isolated. Then there's not a real commitment to get well. There's only a commitment to be less miserable. And that's where we have to challenge folks at different levels. I think about the imagination and like the tenderness that we talk about that's required to help people chip away at like what's gotten them. Addiction is a means to an escape, and they're escaping pain, trauma. And until we're committed to healing, then I don't see how we're gonna get to a solution. We have to commit to building and providing a kind of healing that transcends the buildings that we build.
Something that I was in shock the first day when I got here and I see the amount of people being on the street in a rich country, in a rich city. I mean, it was unbelievable for me. Coming from a poor place, third world country, but something that I was noticing that we have the same problem as well there, but maybe not that visible, because also there is a big sense of community. Like somebody can own a property and they can have their own house, but they allowed somebody else to build a shelter next to their house. And also something that is more common is that sometimes people got together as a community and they build their shelters into a property that is not theirs. But something that we as church has been involved in, I mentioned earlier that we are building houses like a Habitat for Humanity model, but the difference is that these houses are for free, because sometimes those models, when people, they will pay back a little amount, sometimes they don't even have that little amount of money. And then that's why we got involved in it. But yeah, it's very interesting how the sense of community and supporting one each other, even living in the same conditions, can make a big difference. At least to don't be at least be different. Yes.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just make, I guess, I mean, I think everything, I agree with what everybody said. And I was just going to say that maybe, yeah, I totally agree with what Awad said about the state, the role of the state. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with sort of the America becoming an underdeveloping country, basically. And the bar is so low, like we don't, yeah, I don't know what our expectations are of the state. So that we definitely have to have a conversation about that. But just to say that I think, and when I was listening to the bishop, there are some interesting lessons about housing from Latin America. And it's funny because we always, it's always some sort of state institution or NGO coming from Europe or the US to Latin America to teach us how to do stuff or teach them how to do stuff. But there are some lessons I think that can be learned. I mean, about cooperatives and CCTs and lots of interesting sort of housing initiatives. And maybe there's an interesting north-south exchange that can happen, that could take place around homelessness, because it would be interesting to see if LA should invite people from India, from Brazil, and say, okay, how did you guys resolve some of these questions? I think that would be like a really interesting exchange. But then also to just say that I agree very much with what Karen said as well, which is that, I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of religious communities. Are you willing to clothe the unclothed? And we need to have those discussions again. And I think Homeboy definitely, I mean, the modern lepers are the gang members and the homeless. And that language of tenderness and kinship is what the world needs. And yeah, so that's what I would say.
All right. Thank you so much. I believe we are at our time right now. It's 12:30. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all to everybody online, and just really appreciate all of these wonderful people who I'm sitting here with today. So thank you so much to all of you as well. Take care. Thanks.